But I'm going to start off with an interesting one. This is a survey completed by FIFA and FIFPro. I'm just going to be back to us in just one moment. They had a study of online activity, shall we say, during the last Euros and the African Cup of Nations. They found that the most abused people in the entire period were Saka and Rashford, of course, the guys who missed the penalties in the Euro final against Italy. In addition, 40% of the abuse was, I think it was racist in nature, and 38% was homophobic in nature. Is it just because, online is easy? It's so-called anonymous, and all these keyboard warriors are very, very tough.
I think we've gone beyond that. I think the keyboard warriors are definitely one huge aspect. But I think the problem is you have players who are on the field, like the chants we thought were going away from football, they're not going away. The abuse that is hurled at players, the abuse, like this is a small example, but at one of the fights in Manchester, it was the Amir Khan fight. There was an incident with, is it Phil Jones underneath the stadium where if I'm trying to think which player it was one of the Man City players, and it was his mother got in a fight with someone, and it was over him. It was at an entirely different event, a different sport, boxing, as opposed to football, and his family members are getting abused. And I think the problem is what starts out as anonymous online, and that's obviously how they can track this and give statistics as to who the most abused players are. It spills out onto the street, and it spills out onto not just players being abused, but a very angry and scary world for if you're a young black athlete in the UK. What went on at the Euros would seriously make you question being a participant in a sport where there's like a mural being destroyed in the case of Rashford. It's just a society, and I think online abuse, it's a reflection of some deep-rooted, very, very wrong feelings in society. And if they're getting away with it online, the problem is, I think what you can get away with online eventually spills into, because you become emboldened by the fact that there's no follow-up. And I think that's one of the big reasons why every social media platform has an obligation to identify people when they sign up. Identify them by submitting a document or something to give some level of security that when they do this, they will be sanctioned.
And it does sound a bit like kind of Orwellian and Big Brother watching you. But I do understand where you're coming from. I understand where you're coming from. This is to cut down on the blackguardism and the idiocy that goes on. But I don't think it's ever really going to come into play, because I mean, it's if you remove that, then all of a sudden the political parties, the main political parties who receive funding from these online platforms, won't be able to operate their bots and so on. So that's it's going to do away with a lot.
You could have people have multiple accounts. I wouldn't have an issue with that. I actually think if people want to have hundreds of accounts, fine, do that if you want. But you need to be able to identify the source of that account. And I think it's getting to a stage where too little happens. Even if you say, okay, look, John down the road, for some bizarre reason, he wants to have 400 accounts coming from his one laptop or PC. He clearly has not much else going on in his life. But just an identification, some level of certainty that we're not going to track you unless you say something online that is inciting hate speech. And I think we need to be really mindful of the message it gives to other young men and women coming through in sports in general.
Again, and it's not just like we're talking about sports because we're a sports show, but this is in general as well. One thing there's a slightly mix up on that. I got reminded that it was 40% homophobic and 38% racist. Now we'll come on to that in not the next one story. And again, this is some people say like, why aren't there more gay footballers? Well, I think that while there is, I interviewed, I spoke before, I interviewed a gay footballer who was playing here in Russia, and I didn't mention before, and his teammates were fine with him, the club was fine with him. Even some of the supporters who kind of knew across the club, they kind of knew, or they had found out, or they were okay, because a couple of them were gay themselves. They were like, okay, that's fine. This is a big Moscow club. However, when I said to him, why wouldn't you come out and do something? He just said, it's not my job. I'm like, why should I be different? I'm just a footballer. And that's okay. But then we see the amount of online abuse that goes on. I mean, it's horrific. And I don't know. And we'll come on to it in a moment. But it is very, very difficult to come to bears with. But one thing about this, when they focused on the abuse that was given to players, most of it focused on key moments of games. It wasn't just, he's black, we hate him. It was because that N-word missed a penalty.
And that's the worry. Well, like, again, every form of abuse, I'm not detracting from the other, but the fact that your gut reaction in moments of anger or upset with the team is to instantly blame something, which I hate to point this out, but your color or your sexuality are not the reasons you're missing a penalty. And that's the issue. If that's your go-to position, that's the thing that springs to your mind, and that's the sort of abuse that comes out, it's really quite worrying. And I think just in general, it's a reflection of society that these sort of people have got away with this sort of things. They think it's acceptable to say. It's also, I think it's a very good thing to see surveys like this bringing home to the rest of us who aren't in that position how vulnerable you must feel to be an athlete in those circumstances. And as you said about the homophobic abuse, you wonder why more athletes aren't coming out. Well, if you have homophobic abuse directed at players who have not come out and may in fact be heterosexual, what does that tell you about society? How welcoming is the world when you have that much intense pressure on you?
That's it, right. And look, we discussed this way back. It was on the radio about the abuse given to people who were, especially who kind of were saying, like in regards to the conflict in Ukraine, it was that you were a submissive gay, that you were like a little bitch, you're doing this, like that. That's the abuse that gets doled out, and being gay is being seen as being weak somehow, of character, of physical strength, of mentality. So it's a terrible situation. And